Vice President J.D. Vance arrives at the CNN studios in Washington, D.C., for what should be a routine joint interview with White House Press Secretary Karoline Leavitt. The network has been promoting this exclusive sit-down for days as part of their political coverage series. Vance, known for his measured responses and thoughtful demeanor, has agreed to the interview primarily to discuss the administration's new economic initiatives targeting rural communities. Behind the scenes, producer Marcus Whitley is having a last-minute discussion with the assigned interviewer, Allison Pierce, a rising star at the network known for her sharp questions and distinctive blue hair. At 32, Pierce has developed a reputation for confrontational interviews that generate social media buzz. Marcus reminds her to maintain professionalism while still asking hard-hitting questions. "Remember, we want substance, not just clips for Twitter," Marcus cautions. Pierce adjusts her blazer and checks her reflection. "Don't worry, I know what I'm doing. These administration officials need to be held accountable." Marcus sighs. "Just keep it professional. This isn't one of your podcast debates." Meanwhile, in the green room, Vance reviews his briefing materials one last time. Having grown up in working-class Ohio before his journey through the Marines, Yale Law School, and venture capital, he carries himself with a quiet confidence that comes from navigating many different worlds. Today, he's particularly focused on communicating the administration's rural broadband initiative, a personal priority given his Appalachian roots. As the makeup artist finishes with Vance and Leavitt, they exchange notes on potential topics. Leavitt, only 35 but already seasoned by her years in political communications, mentions hearing that Pierce might try to provoke emotional responses. "Just stick to the talking points," she tells Vance with a confident smile. "I'll handle any curveballs." "I've watched a few of her interviews," Vance replies, slipping his notes into his jacket pocket. "She's smart, but sometimes more interested in creating moments than understanding policy." A production assistant appears at the door. "2 minutes, please." As they walk toward the studio, Leavitt receives a text from her deputy with a last-minute alert. Pierce had just posted a cryptic social media message about unmasking political performers 15 minutes earlier. "Seems like someone's looking to make headlines," Leavitt murmurs, showing Vance the message. He nods calmly. "Let's just focus on the American people who need these programs. The rest is just noise." The lights come up, cameras roll, and for the first 10 minutes, the interview proceeds professionally. Pierce asks about policy initiatives, congressional challenges, and upcoming legislation. Then, deliberately, she shifts to more personal territory. 30 minutes into the interview, Pierce turns her attention to Leavitt, her tone noticeably shifting. The studio lights seem to intensify as she leans forward, her posture changing from professional curiosity to something more predatory. "Ms. Leavitt, you've been criticized for your handling of questions about women's reproductive rights, with some suggesting you're simply parroting outdated views to please your male colleagues. Do you ever feel your own voice is being silenced in this administration?" The question hangs in the air, clearly designed to provoke. In the control room, Marcus winces. This wasn't the direction they had discussed. From his chair, Vance observes Pierce's technique, the subtle emphasis on male colleagues, the implication of Leavitt as a puppet rather than a professional. Leavitt begins her response calmly. "I speak for this administration because I believe in—" Pierce interrupts, smirking. "It just seems convenient that a young woman like yourself would abandon positions that most women your age support. Some have called it careerism over conviction." The studio grows tense. Camera operators exchange glances. The producer shifts uncomfortably in his chair. One of the sound technicians mouths "wow" to her colleague. Leavitt, maintaining composure despite the flush rising in her cheeks, starts again. "I appreciate your concern for my autonomy, but let's be honest." Pierce cuts in, her voice dripping with condescension, twirling a strand of her blue hair around her finger. "Your role is essentially to make policies palatable that many find deeply problematic for women. How do you sleep at night knowing that?" In the control room, Marcus presses his headset closer to his ear. "Allison, reel it back," he says, but she appears to ignore him, her earpiece conveniently adjusted away from her ear moments before. Leavitt takes a measured breath, her years of press training evident in how she maintains her poise. She begins to respond with a practiced line about her personal convictions when Vance, who has been watching silently, shifts in his chair. It's subtle, a small adjustment of his posture, a slight lean forward, but the movement catches Pierce's attention. Through his own earpiece, Marcus can be heard instructing the camera operators, "Get ready to switch to VP Vance." Before Leavitt can complete her response, Vice President Vance, who has been observing the exchange with increasing concern, places his hands deliberately on the armrests of his chair. The movement is calm but purposeful. Those who know him recognize this as a sign that he's about to speak from conviction rather than from talking points. "Ms. Pierce," he begins, his voice measured but firm enough to command attention. The camera swings to capture his face, which reveals not anger but something more complex, a mixture of disappointment and resolve. "Ms. Pierce," Vance begins, his voice calm but firm, "I'd like to address what just happened here." Pierce turns toward him, momentarily caught off guard. The blue-haired journalist had clearly been prepared for Leavitt's response, not the vice president's intervention. Her confident smirk falters slightly as she reorients herself. "What we just witnessed," Vance continues, "was a profound example of the very thing you claim to stand against. You've just suggested that Ms. Leavitt, a highly accomplished professional with degrees from St. Anselm College and Harvard, lacks the capacity for independent thought because her views differ from your own." The studio falls completely silent. Even the usual subtle movements of camera operators and technicians cease. In the control room, Marcus straightens in his chair, sensing the moment's gravity. The notion that women who hold conservative values are somehow betraying their gender is not just condescending. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of what equality actually means. True equality includes respecting the diversity of thought among all people, including women. Pierce opens her mouth to interject, but Vance continues with a gentle but unmistakable authority that makes interruption feel inappropriate. "I grew up in a household headed by my grandmother, Ms. Pierce. She worked at the Armco steel plant in Middletown, Ohio for years. She never finished high school, but she taught me more about dignity and respect than any Ivy League institution ever could." The camera catches a close-up of Vance's face. There's no performative emotion, just authentic conviction as he speaks. "She used to tell me, J.D., judge people by how they treat others, not by whether they agree with you." That wisdom seems particularly relevant here. Ant speaks without raising his voice or showing anger, but with unmistakable clarity. "Ms. Leavitt doesn't need me to defend her capabilities. Her record speaks for itself. But I will defend the principle that in a functioning democracy, we must be able to disagree without questioning each other's integrity or autonomy." He pauses, allowing his words to resonate. In the silence, a technician's dropped pen can be heard hitting the floor. "You know, in many places I grew up, Women held views across the political spectrum. The mother who worked 2 jobs to support her family while advocating for union rights. The small business owner who fought regulations she felt were strangling her ability to provide for her employees. The teacher who believed deeply in traditional values while dedicating her life to educating the next generation. None of these women were any less authentic or independent because of their political beliefs. He continues, his cadence measured but engaging, connecting personal experience to broader principles. My grandmother voted differently than many of her friends, but they respected each other because they recognized something more important than political agreement: the dignity of allowing each person to form their own conclusions. Pierce shifts uncomfortably, her prepared follow-ups suddenly seeming inadequate. What troubles me most about your question, Vance concludes, isn't that you disagree with our policies? That's your right. It's that you've assumed bad faith from someone simply because they view the world differently than you do. That approach doesn't lead to better understanding. It only deepens our divisions. He leans back slightly, his point made without theatrics. I believe the American people deserve better than that. They deserve a conversation that respects their intelligence and their ability to hold diverse viewpoints in good faith. The camera catches Leavitt's subtle nod of appreciation, not for being defended, but for the principle being articulated. Pierce, visibly unsettled but professionally composed, attempts to pivot. Let's return to the administration's position on... Actually, Vance interjects with unexpected gentleness, I think Ms. Leavitt was in the middle of responding to your question. I'd appreciate if we could allow her to finish her thought without interruption. This small gesture, turning the spotlight back to Leavitt rather than dominating the conversation, communicates volumes. The camera turns to Leavitt, who proceeds to articulate her position with the clarity and conviction that had been repeatedly interrupted. Pierce, visibly unsettled, attempts to steer the conversation back to policy points, but the moment has fundamentally shifted the dynamic of the interview. The remaining questions, though still challenging, come with noticeably less condescension and more substance. By morning, the exchange has gone viral. Clips of Vance's measured response spread across social media platforms, transcending typical partisan bubbles. The hashtag number "respectful disagreement" trends nationally, with the 3-minute clip being viewed over 7 million times before noon. In the White House Communications Office, staffers gather around monitors displaying analytics from various platforms. The unexpected moment has cut through the usual political noise, reaching audiences who typically tune out political content. Comment sections, normally cesspools of partisan vitriol, show unusual consensus, not about policy positions, but about the tone of discourse. Did you see this? A young staffer asks, showing his colleague a post from a well-known progressive commentator. Disagree with Vance on virtually everything, but that was a masterclass in calling out condescension without becoming condescending yourself. Many commentators, even those critical of the administration's policies, note the contrast between Pierce's dismissive tone and Vance's respectful but firm rebuttal. Media analysis pieces with titles like "The Vance Moment," "When Defending Decency Went Viral," and "Beyond the Culture Wars," a template for respectful disagreement, populate news sites across the political spectrum. In her apartment that evening, Pierce watches the online reaction with growing concern. Her phone hasn't stopped buzzing with notifications. Her producer calls, informing her that the network executives want to discuss the interview and public response. It's not about the content of your questions, Allison, Marcus explains carefully. It's how you asked them. The tone undermined the substance. For the first time in her career, she wonders if her approach has undermined her journalistic credibility. Sitting at her kitchen island, she replays the interview, seeing with fresh eyes how her facial expressions and interruptions communicated contempt rather than critique. At the White House, Leavitt's phone similarly overflows with messages. What surprises her most is the source. Women across the political spectrum, many prefacing their support with, "Though I don't share your views." Several note that regardless of political differences, Pierce's dismissive attitude represented exactly the kind of treatment professional women have long fought against. "This is bigger than politics," reads one message from a prominent feminist writer who had previously criticized Leavitt's positions. "When we suggest women can't think for themselves because they don't agree with us, we become what we claim to fight against." Vance, characteristic of his low-key approach, doesn't comment on the viral moment. At a scheduled meeting with rural development officials later that day, an aide mentions the positive online response. "That's not why we did the interview," Vance replies simply, redirecting attention to the broadband initiative. When pressed by another staffer about whether he'd planned his response, he simply says, "Some principles transcend politics." Treating each other with dignity shouldn't be controversial. 3 days later, Pierce publishes a thoughtful editorial in The Atlantic. The piece, titled "When My Questioning Became Part of the Problem," becomes its own viral moment. She acknowledges that in her pursuit of hard-hitting journalism, she had fallen into the trap of dismissing viewpoints different from her own. "I've long criticized the echo chambers of modern discourse," she writes, "while failing to recognize I was creating my own. By questioning Ms. Leavitt's agency rather than her arguments, I committed the very offense I've condemned in others." While standing by her policy positions, she expresses regret for suggesting that Leavitt's views couldn't be genuinely held. Feminism must include the right of women to reach different conclusions, or it isn't feminism at all. It's just another form of paternalism with a progressive veneer. The following week, Pierce requests a follow-up interview with both Vance and Leavitt. Her network, seeing an opportunity for a constructive narrative arc, quickly approves. The administration, after initial hesitation, agrees on the condition that the focus remain on policy substance. This time, as cameras roll, Pierce's approach is markedly different. Her questions remain challenging, pressing on policy contradictions, requesting evidence for claims, demanding clarity on vague assertions. But the undertone of personal dismissal is noticeably absent. "I disagree with your position on this issue," she says at one point to Leavitt, "but I'm interested in understanding the reasoning behind it." The resulting conversation, exploring genuine policy differences with mutual respect, becomes the subject of a journalism school case study months later. Viewer feedback shows audiences found it refreshingly substantive, with one comment summarizing the general sentiment. "I still don't know who I agree with more, but for once I feel like I actually understand both sides." 6 months later, at a media conference in Chicago, Pierce and Leavitt appear on a panel together titled "Beyond Gotcha: Rebuilding Substantive Political Discourse." Their unlikely professional respect, born from a moment of conflict, offers a template that few expected, but many find themselves hungry for: the possibility that political opponents might disagree profoundly without assuming the worst of each other. As Vance later remarks in a rare comment on the incident during a speech at his alma mater, "Democracy doesn't require agreement. It requires the humility to recognize that none of us has a monopoly on truth, and the courage to engage differences with curiosity rather than contempt. In that space, we might find not just civil discourse, but wisdom none of us could reach alone."